Mysterious masked person. The house was peaceful under the moonlight, and it seemed like it would be a simple summer week without my parents. They trusted me to take care of everything, and so far, I had been enjoying video games, staying up late, every kid's dream. Around 11 o'clock p.m., I was lounging on the couch, absorbed in my game. My phone buzzed beside me. A message from an unknown number popped up on the screen. Hi. I frowned. Who was this? I asked, but the reply came instantly, mixed with irritation and aggression. You don't know who this is? I tried explaining that I had just gotten a new phone and lost my contacts, but the angry messages kept coming. I assumed it was a prank and put my phone on silent, returning to my game. I wasn't sure how much time had passed, but I was startled by a sound. A knock on the bedroom window. At first, I thought I was imagining it. It was late, and I'd been alone for days. Maybe my mind was playing tricks on me. Still, I cautiously moved to the window, pulling the curtain aside. Nothing, just an empty yard. But I knew I'd heard something. I pulled out my phone, intending to call my mom, when I noticed several unread messages from the same unknown number. The last one sent chills down my spine. I'm here. I froze. My heart pounded in my chest, each beat louder than the last. I immediately tried to call my mom, but the screen flashed, no signal. No way. We always had good reception here. I ran to the back porch and listened. Maybe, just maybe, someone was crying for help. I had years of self-defense training, and despite the fear surging through me, I was ready to defend myself. This could be a setup, a trick. I grabbed an old baseball bat from the garage and stepped into the backyard. The night was eerily quiet, which made me even more uneasy. I walked toward the edge of the trees, sweeping through the shadows. I shouted into the night, trying to sound confident, demanding who was there and telling them not to mess with me. Suddenly, a flashlight flickered, shining straight at me from deep in the woods. Whoever was holding it was too far for me to see their face, but they were trying to get my attention. The light went out as quickly as it had come on, and the screaming started again, this time more desperate. I slowly made my way toward the spot where the light had appeared. As I got closer to the trees, my heart pounded louder than my footsteps. The woods were dense, with towering trees casting deep shadows. I knew I shouldn't be doing this, but I couldn't stop. I yelled out, asking where the person was. A voice answered from somewhere ahead, a faint whisper saying,
"Here, help me."
I stepped deeper into the woods. My grip tightened around the bat, and my legs felt heavy as I moved forward. I saw a figure. My voice trembled as I asked if it was the person calling for help. The figure didn't answer. Instead, it started moving. In a split second, I realized this wasn't someone tied up. This was someone alive, and they were running toward me. Panic surged through me, and something inside screamed at me to get away to save my life. I didn't know how, but I ran. I slammed the porch door behind me, locking it, then sprinted to my room, slamming the door shut. The knocking started again, first at the front door, then at the window. It was relentless, as if he was trying to break in from every corner. He wasn't playing anymore. He was hunting me. I heard the sound of glass shattering from the living room. My heart raced as I realized he was inside. Footsteps echoed through the house, slow and deliberate. He was looking for me. I hid behind the bedroom door, gripping the bat. I held on so tightly my knuckles turned white. The footsteps grew closer. I could hear his breathing just outside my door. The door creaked open, and I saw the wolf mask peeking out. He cautiously stepped inside, unaware that I was right behind him. In that split second, I swung the bat as hard as I could. It slammed into his head. He collapsed to the ground, and I didn't stop. I swung over and over until I was sure he wouldn't get up. The house was now quiet after the chaos. Inside, everything was still. The intruder in the wolf mask lay motionless on the floor while I stood over him, panting, hands shaking as I gripped the bloodied bat. I stared down at the man, his body sprawled across the floor. The wolf mask, now cracked, still covered his head, hiding his face. For a moment, I froze, unable to process what I had just done. My phone still had no signal, but I needed help. I needed to get out of there. I rushed to the landline in the kitchen, my hands trembling uncontrollably as I dialed 911. I struggled to find the words, pressing the phone tightly to my ear, trying to calm down. I glanced back at the hallway leading to my bedroom, terrified that the masked man would get up again. The distant sound of sirens broke the silence of the night. Red and blue lights flickered across the walls as the police car stopped in front of the house. Their grim faces approached the door as I shakily opened it. The officers stepped inside, examining the broken glass, the signs of a struggle, and finally, the man lying on the floor. One officer knelt down, checking for a pulse. He said, "You did the right thing," as if he had seen this horror many times before. They told me to sit down and breathe, but I couldn't focus on anything except that mask, the wolf mask. Why? Why did he choose to wear it? The unconscious man was lifted onto a stretcher. His mask still hadn't been removed. My mind was still reeling from the events that had just unfolded. The next morning, I was at the police station. The officers asked me about the man, whether I had ever seen him before. I shook my head, explaining the messages, the strange knocks, and the wolf mask. Then, they told me his name was Thomas, and he had been on the run for years. A detective handed me a file filled with old newspaper clippings and photographs. The story they told me was chilling. Thomas had a disturbing past. Years ago, he had committed a series of home invasions in nearby towns. He would stalk his victims for days, learning their routines before making his move, and he always wore a mask to cover half his face. But it wasn't just any mask. The wolf mask had become his signature. In every report, survivors described the same thing. A tall man in a wolf mask, terrorizing families, always escaping before the police could catch him, until now. The final piece of the mystery was revealed when the detective, now more familiar with Thomas's case, explained why he chose the wolf mask. The detective slid a newspaper article toward me. It had a blurry photo of the wolf mask next to a headline that read, "Wolf Stalker Evades Capture." The detective said the wolf represented a predator, a cunning hunter. Thomas saw himself as the wolf, and his victims were the prey. It terrified me to think about how long he might have been watching me, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. He had been toying with me, like a wolf plays with its prey. That night, back home, I sat alone in the living room, the faint hum of the TV filling the silence. My parents wouldn't be leaving me alone for a long time after this. The mystery of why he wore the mask had been solved, but the fear of that night still lingered. I didn't know if I would ever feel truly safe again, but one thing I did know, I would never forget the image of that cracked wolf mask lying on the floor. Intruder from the garage. It was just another long, dull day at school, but as I walked home, the excitement of Friday relieved me. Tomorrow was a day off from school. Finally, I could relax. As I approached home, I noticed something strange. The garage door was wide open, and the light inside was still on. My dad had left early that day for a business trip, so he must have rushed and forgotten to close it. I didn't think much of it at the time. I went into the garage, turned off the light, and pulled the door shut behind me. The silence of the house welcomed me as I stepped inside, and the thought of having the whole place to myself felt like freedom. My mom had gone to a friend's house for the evening, So I settled in for a night of video games and movies. Hours passed as I immersed myself in my game. The house was quiet except for the occasional noise from the TV. I decided to get a drink, and as I walked into the kitchen, something caught my attention. The light in the garage was on again. I paused. A strange, eerie feeling washed over me. Had I forgotten to turn it off? Or had my mom come home? But I hadn't heard her come in. My heart began to race as I approached the garage door, my footsteps feeling heavy. As I stepped into the garage, every drawer in my dad's workshop was open. His tools were scattered across the floor as if someone had frantically searched for something, but there was no one here. I quickly turned back inside, locking the garage door. Something was wrong. I could feel it. I prepared to head back to the living room, planning to try to watch TV to calm down. Then, from behind me, I heard the garage door handle rattle violently. I froze, staring at the door, watching it shake harder, as if someone on the other side was desperately trying to get in. I grabbed my phone, my hand trembling as I realized I needed to get out of the house. In my panic, I didn't notice that the noise had suddenly stopped. The silence was chilling. It was too quiet. I ran straight for the front door. My only thought was to escape. But as I stepped into the living room, I froze in my tracks. He was there, a large man, his back turned to me. In his hand, he gripped a hatchet, likely taken from my dad's workshop. I held my breath, terrified he would turn around and see me. The TV was still playing, masking the sound of my footsteps, and I knew this was my only chance. Going back upstairs was impossible. I quietly turned around and headed for the back door, trying to remain calm. Once outside, I didn't stop running. I hurried to my neighbor's house, knocking on the door until they let me in. I waited there, heart pounding, watching my house from across the street as I prayed the intruder wouldn't come looking for me. I knocked on my neighbor's door, my heart racing, breath coming in gasps. It felt like an eternity before Mr. Thompson finally opened the door, his face etched with confusion. I recounted everything that had happened to him. His eyes widened, and without saying a word, he grabbed a flashlight and his old baseball bat. He was determined to check my house for me, assuring me that everything would be okay. I reluctantly stayed behind, watching him cross the street. My body still trembled with fear, my mind racing with worst-case scenarios. I had called the police. They were on their way, but the thought of that man in my house, with my dad's hatchet in hand, haunted me. I watched as Mr. Thompson cautiously approached the front door, using the flashlight to scan the windows and garage. He disappeared inside. I strained to listen for anything, but everything was eerily silent. Suddenly, I saw him step outside, and from across the street, a small voice echoed back, "There's no one there. The house is empty." A wave of relief washed over me, but I still needed to remain vigilant. As Mr. Thompson started to walk toward me, I felt that lingering anxiety return. Before I could voice my concerns, a dark figure shifted behind him. My blood ran cold. The intruder. He was there, emerging from the shadows of the house, with an axe glinting under the dim porch light. I screamed, trying to warn Mr. Thompson, but it was too late. As he turned around, the intruder lunged at him. A fierce struggle ensued. Mr. Thompson swung the baseball bat, but the intruder was strong. The two grappled, the axe dangerously close to Mr. Thompson's head as they stumbled across the lawn. My legs wouldn't move, paralyzed with fear as I watched the scene unfold. Every second felt like a nightmare. Mr. Thompson tried to deliver a solid blow with the bat, striking the man's ribs, but it wasn't enough. The intruder howled in pain, but instead of backing off, he raised the axe, ready to attack. Just as the axe came down, Mr. Thompson lunged to the side, narrowly avoiding the strike. In that moment of distraction, Mr. Thompson landed another blow, throwing the intruder off balance. I finally decided to rush forward to help, but before I could reach them, the sound of police sirens rang out. The intruder looked up at the sound of the sirens, and in a final effort to escape, he sprinted toward the backyard. Mr. Thompson staggered to his feet, breathing heavily but still standing strong. The police arrived just in time, their flashlights cutting through the darkness as they chased after the man. Within minutes, they had subdued him. The man thrashed wildly, growling like a wild beast, but the police quickly overpowered him, pinning him to the ground and cuffing his hands behind his back. I stood there, trembling, watching the whole scene unfold. Mr. Thompson walked over to me, holding his side where he had been hit, but he still managed to smile. "You're safe now." I felt grateful, as if I had been saved. I recounted every detail I could remember to the police, but all I wanted to do was forget. I sat down on Mr. Thompson's porch, my body shaking, watching the man being driven away in the police car. It was all over, but the image of the intruder's face, his wild eyes, and the sound of the axe slicing through the air would haunt me forever. Mr. Thompson sat next to me, placing his hand on my shoulder for reassurance. "You did the right thing, kid," he said softly. "It's over now." But deep down, I knew the fear would linger with me. I would never forget how close I had come to being trapped in the grip of something truly evil. Nightmare Neighbor. The old, tall apartment building stood under the dim glow of the streetlights. It was late, and most of the windows were dark. Rena stood outside the building, staring up at the second floor where her apartment was. She had lived here for a few months, and the place had always been quiet. Until Arthur moved in next door. Rena's apartment was at the end of the hallway on the second floor, and the trip to take out the trash usually took only a few minutes. But tonight, she felt eyes on her. As she was about to turn the corner at the end of the hall, there he was. Arthur was standing by his door, as if waiting for her. He always found a reason to talk and stand too close to her. She kept her head down, mumbled a quick greeting, and brushed past him toward the stairs. This time, he said nothing. A chill ran down Rena's spine. Something was different tonight, something that made her more uneasy than before. Rena stepped into her apartment and quickly shut the door. She took a moment to calm herself, telling herself she was overreacting. She turned off the lights in the living room, planning to head to bed and watch some TV. It was late, and she was tired but not quite ready to sleep. As she passed the broom closet, she heard a faint sound, like a rustling from inside. Her heart skipped a beat, and she froze, staring at the closet door. With trembling hands, she reached for the closet handle. She hesitated. Every instinct screamed at her not to open it, but she had to. She couldn't just leave it. She pulled the door open. Arthur was standing there, in her closet. For a split second, time seemed to stop. He was just standing there, staring at her, unblinking, with a twisted smile on his face. She gasped, stumbling backward. Her heart raced as panic rose inside her. He stepped forward, crawling out of the closet like a predator closing in on its prey. She ran into the bedroom, slamming the door shut, but she didn't have time to lock it. The door flew open, and Arthur was right there, his face wild. She dashed for the bathroom, her final place of refuge. She slammed the door just as Arthur reached the bedroom. Her hands fumbled with the lock. Rena pressed her back against the cold bathroom wall. Her breath came in sharp gasps as Arthur pounded on the door, trying to break through. The thin wooden door was all that separated her from the man who had been stalking her for weeks, his sick grin etched into her mind. Thankfully, she had brought her phone with her. She gripped it tightly, her fingers trembling as she spoke to the police. Her voice was barely a whisper, fear choking her words. Arthur slammed the door again, the wood splintering under the force. Rena knew it wouldn't hold much longer. Suddenly, the pounding stopped. She held her breath, pressing her ear to the door, straining to hear any sound. Was he gone? Had he given up? Arthur stood outside the bathroom door, his breathing ragged, his eyes wild with anticipation. His patience was wearing thin. His hand hovered over the doorknob before he stepped back, glancing at Rena's bedroom. He knew she was cornered, with nowhere to go. Slowly, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, shiny knife. His fingers tightened around the handle, and his eyes narrowed. With a single powerful kick, the bathroom door splintered apart. The door burst open, and Arthur lunged inside, his eyes wide and feral. She backed up until she was almost against the wall. She screamed for him to stay away, but Arthur didn't stop. He lunged at her, grabbing her arm in a grip so tight it would leave bruises. Rena tried to pull away, but he was too strong. Pain shot down her spine as he twisted her wrist, pinning it to the wall. The phone slipped from her hand, crashing to the floor. Arthur's face was now only a few centimeters from hers, whispering threats because she always ignored him in the hallway. Rena struggled, trying to break free, but he pulled her closer, tightening his grip. His knife slashed through the air, grazing her arm. She gasped as a sharp pain cut through her skin, blood trickling down. The sound of sirens tore through the night, growing louder as the police raced toward the apartment building. Flashing lights reflected off the windows, like a beacon of hope in the suffocating darkness. Inside, Rena's vision blurred with panic and pain. He shoved her against the wall again, laughing maniacally as he brought the knife closer to her throat. Her body screamed for escape. Her free hand groped blindly along the counter near the sink, desperately searching for anything she could use to defend herself. She grabbed a glass soap bottle and, without thinking, smashed it over Arthur's head. The glass shattered, and he staggered back, momentarily dazed. Arthur staggered. The knife slipped from his hand and fell to the floor. Rena did not wait. She rushed out the door, holding her throbbing arm that was bleeding from the cut he made. She ran out of the bathroom and into the living room, her mind screaming for escape. But Arthur wasn't far behind. Stunned, but enraged, he grabbed the knife again and charged toward her, blood streaming down his face from where the glass had struck him. The police burst through the front door of the apartment complex, racing up the stairs to the second floor. They knew they had to act quickly. Rena reached the living room, but her legs buckled beneath her, sending her crashing to the floor. She could feel Arthur's looming presence, approaching with the knife in hand. His eyes were now filled with rage, the twisted delight gone. He reached for her, grabbing her hair. Rena winced in pain, trying to get up, her body screaming for help. Arthur growled, his voice low and venomous. "There's nowhere left to run, girl." Just as he raised the knife again, the apartment door burst open with a loud crash. The police swarmed into the apartment, guns drawn. "Drop the weapon," one of them shouted, their voices slicing through the tension. Arthur hesitated, giving Rena the opening she needed. She kicked his leg hard, causing him to cry out in pain. She ran toward the police, gasping for breath, blood dripping from her arm, but the nightmare was finally over. Rena sat on the edge of the ambulance, her mind still reeling, her body in shock. She watched as the police loaded Arthur into the back of their car. The flashing lights of the police car faded into the night as they drove away. Run away from strangers. The grocery store sat in the middle of a vast, empty parking lot, bathed in the faint glow of streetlights. It was 2 a.m. The store was closed, and the eerie quiet surrounded it. The night was still, until a soft tapping on the glass echoed in the darkness. I was the night shift manager here. Usually, things were calm, and nothing happened. It was just me, stocking shelves during the quiet hours while the outside world slept. I had been working non-stop since my shift began at 10 p.m., trying to get everything done. My focus was broken when I heard the faint tapping. It was coming from the front of the store. I left my cart and headed toward the sound. Through the large glass windows, I saw him, a man. He was leaning against the glass, trying to peer inside. His clothes were tattered, his face expressionless, with a hollow, vacant look in his eyes. He saw me the moment I came into view. I approached the glass door. I asked him what he wanted. He demanded I open the door. His face was emotionless, no hint of a smile, just cold eyes staring at me. I told him the store was closed and that he couldn't be here. As I turned to walk away, a loud bang startled me. The man's fists were pounding on the glass, over and over, each strike louder and angrier than the last. My heart raced. This guy wasn't just a harmless drifter. I pulled out my phone, showing him I was ready to call the police. Only then did he back off, his eyes still locked on me, filled with rage. Slowly, he stepped back into the shadows of the parking lot. The tension in me eased slightly. He was gone. I put my phone away and tried to focus back on my work. 15 minutes passed. The tapping, the pounding, the man, all of it faded from my mind as I immersed myself in stocking the shelves. But then I heard it, the sound of metal breaking, like something being torn apart. I abandoned the stroller and ran forward, fear rising. My heart sank when I saw the glass door slightly open. The lock, the only thing that kept the door secure, was missing. Fear gripped me as I realized what this meant. I need to go to the office, call the police now. I turned to run for the office, but I froze in place. Standing not far from me, blocking my path, was the man. His expression hadn't changed, still cold, still lifeless, filled with rage. I don't think anything. I just run. I burst through the door, the man right behind me. Suddenly, a beat-up van screeched into view, speeding toward the front of the store. It swerved dangerously, nearly hitting me as it stopped, my heart pounding in my chest. I moved forward, running past the van, but then everything flipped upside down. A sharp pain suddenly exploded at the back of my head. My body lurched forward as I fell to the ground. I didn't even have time to process what had happened before the world started fading. I felt hands grabbing me, roughly lifting me off the cold pavement. My vision blurred, darkness closing in, and the last thing I remembered was the roar of the van's engine and the sensation of being dragged inside. I woke up with a throbbing headache, my wrists tightly bound behind me. The van bounced and swayed as it sped down an unfamiliar road. My mind was foggy, disoriented. For a moment, I didn't know where I was. Then it all came rushing back. I started to string it together. Man, the truck. Perhaps I was kidnapped by him. My heart raced as I realized I needed to act, and fast. I glanced around. Inside, it was pitch black, but I could make out a pile of old tools, a rusted toolbox, and some scattered metal pieces on the floor. I twisted my wrists, testing the ropes. They were tight, but I could feel a slight give, just enough to give me hope. I could hear the driver muttering to himself up front. His voice was low, angry. This wasn't over. I took a deep breath, calming the panic rising inside me. I needed to think, and I needed to get out. I inched closer to the toolbox, my fingers searching for anything sharp. It was hard, but I found a small, jagged piece of rusted metal. I awkwardly twisted my hands, rubbing the metal against the ropes. My heart pounded with every noise the van made, every bump in the road that might expose me, each one painful enough to make me want to scream. Suddenly, I felt the ropes loosen. A few more scratches and they snapped. My wrists were free, but I couldn't move too quickly. I glanced toward the front seat, where I could see the back of the driver's head. He hadn't realized I was awake yet. I noticed the door latch wasn't locked. I needed a plan. The van slowed as it made a sharp turn onto a dirt road. This was the moment I'd been waiting for. Taking a deep breath, I yanked the back door open and jumped into the night. I hit the ground hard, pain shooting through my body as I tumbled over dirt and gravel. For a second, I thought I wouldn't be able to move, but adrenaline surged through me. I staggered to my feet, running into the thick darkness of the trees. Behind me, the van screeched to a stop. I heard the man shouting, his footsteps pounding as he chased after me, but I didn't look back. I just kept running, my heart hammering in my chest. The trees, the branches, scratched at my skin as I tore through the dense underbrush. My mind was foggy, teetering between fear and survival. I could hear the man crashing through the forest behind me, his breath heavy and furious. I couldn't let him catch me again. Ahead, I spotted a clearing and the faint glow of lights through the trees. A road. If I could get there fast, I'd be safe. I burst out of the woods and onto the road, waving my arms frantically as a car approached. The headlights blinded me, but I didn't care. I needed help. I ran into the middle of the road, screaming for them to stop. The car screeched to a halt, and I collapsed against the hood, gasping for breath. The driver jumped out, shouting something, but I was too exhausted to answer. All I could do was whisper, "Help me." The driver pulled out his phone, calling the police. I glanced back at the man. He stood at the edge of the woods, staring at me with cold, furious eyes. But he didn't come any closer. He knew it was over. The flashing lights of police cars lit up the dark road. Officers surrounded the van. The man already in handcuffs not far away. His face was cold, blank, disturbingly empty. I sat on the curb, still trembling, wrapped in a blanket the police had given me. The world felt strange, like a nightmare I couldn't wake from. But I was grateful, lucky to be alive. I was free. The police assured me that he'd be locked away, that he wouldn't hurt anyone else. But the thought still lingered in my mind. What if I hadn't escaped? What if I hadn't been fast enough? As the first light of dawn crept over the horizon, I stood by the car, watching the police take the man away. The fear was still there, clinging to the edges of my mind, but I knew I had survived. I had been lucky to survive the night shift. Scary night at the toy store. The night sky was heavy, and the large parking lot outside a quiet toy store was dimly lit by a few sparse streetlights. The store was about to close, and Sana, a woman in her 30s, walked toward the entrance. She held a list tightly in her hand. Her daughter's 6th birthday was coming up soon. Inside, the store was nearly empty. Sana walked past shelves filled with toys. She felt excited as she picked up stuffed animals and birthday decorations. As she walked, she had the unsettling feeling that someone was watching her. She glanced over and saw a man at the end of the aisle. He wore a long black coat and had a hat pulled low over his face. He just stood there, staring at her. Sana immediately looked away, pretending not to notice, but she could feel his eyes burning into her. She grabbed the last item on her list and moved to a different aisle, hoping to shake the strange and uneasy feeling. For the next 15 minutes, she tried to continue shopping, moving through different parts of the store. She hurried through checkout, her nerves on edge. After paying, she headed for the exit. The parking lot was almost empty, except for her car and a suspicious gray SUV parked nearby. The vast emptiness made the SUV's proximity unsettling. As she neared her car, Sana's heart raced when she heard a car door open from the other side of the SUV. The man in the black coat emerged from around the SUV. It was the same man from the store. Her fear began to rise as she recognized him. She thought she needed to hide for a while. Sana hurried inside, her breath quickening. The store was nearly empty now, and the isolation was overwhelming. She moved through the aisles, trying to lose the man in the maze of shelves. Every few minutes, she glanced over her shoulder. The man was there, trailing her through the store. He kept his distance, but never let her out of his sight. Her hands trembled as she pulled out her phone. She quickly dialed her husband, and when he answered, she whispered urgently into the phone. He promised he would be there in less than 10 minutes. The minutes felt like hours as she moved around the store, pretending to browse but always keeping an eye on the man. At one point, he seemed to lose interest and walked toward the exit, but as Sana neared the checkout counter, he lined up right behind her. The air felt stifling. She quickly moved through rows of stuffed animals and dolls, praying that the man wouldn't see her anymore. She crouched behind a shelf, pressing her back against it. She looked around, but didn't see him anywhere. For a moment, she dared to hope that he had really left. But then, the soft sound of footsteps on the floor shattered her illusion of safety. He rounded the corner, his figure looming larger as he got closer. Sana's back pressed against the shelf, and a row of dolls wobbled. She flinched in fear as one of them fell to the ground with a soft thud. The man stopped just a few feet away. She glanced, her eyes alert, watching his every move. This close, she could make out more details. His gloved hands, the lower part of his face visible beneath the brim of his hat. A faint, crooked smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. He took another step toward her. He reached into his coat, and for a moment, Sana's heart stopped. Was he pulling out a weapon? What was he about to do? Suddenly, headlights swept across the parking lot as a car pulled in. Sana's husband had arrived, and his car stopped right in front of the toy store. The man glanced toward the lights, his expression stiffening, growing cautious. He stepped back into the shadows as Sana's husband drew closer. Sana saw her husband get out of the car. He walked toward the store, his eyes scanning the parking lot for her. She seized the moment and ran past the man, her heart pounding as she sprinted toward the store entrance. She didn't look back, but she could feel his eyes burning into her as she escaped. Sana rushed through the front door of the store, running toward her husband. Her face was pale, and her hands were trembling, but she was safe. She collapsed into his arms, her breath coming in gasps as the fear that had overwhelmed her began to fade. Her husband looked past her, scanning the store for the man, but the parking lot had returned to its eerie calm. The man in the black coat had disappeared, melting into the shadows. Her husband gripped the steering wheel, ready to drive them home, but Sana couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't over. Later that night, Sana's phone rang. It was a call from the local police station. The man had been caught. They wanted her to come in and give a statement. The man had been arrested just hours after leaving the parking lot. A patrol car had spotted his SUV parked suspiciously in another lot near a shopping mall. When the police approached him casually, he resisted arrest, acting erratically. Sana listened intently as the detective began revealing disturbing details that had come to light after his arrest. During questioning, the man, identified as Dennis, initially refused to cooperate. He claimed he was just shopping late and looking for lost car keys, but his story quickly unraveled. The police found disturbing evidence inside his SUV, items that made Sana's skin crawl. First, there was a knife, wrapped in cloth and hidden under the passenger seat. It wasn't an ordinary knife. The blade was worn, and the handle was smooth from years of use. Next to it was a set of duct tape, rope, and zip ties, all stashed in a small canvas bag. Dennis had likely planned something far worse than just following her. The real horror came when they found the photos. Many were of women, all taken from a distance, some in grocery stores, others as they left malls, a few while walking their dogs. And then Sana's breath caught in her throat. Scattered among the pictures were photos of her, some from the toy store that night, and many others taken before. They were taken when she dropped her daughter off at school, when she went grocery shopping, and even when she left her apartment. Realizing Dennis had been following her for days, maybe weeks, made her feel sick. As the investigation continued, more terrifying truths about Dennis emerged. He often stalked women, but none of his victims had ever filed charges. He was disturbingly careful, always skirting the edges of the law, always evading arrest or detection. 2 years earlier, in another town, Dennis had been investigated for the disappearance of a woman, though no evidence was ever found. The case had since gone cold. Sana was horrified to realize she could have easily become another cold case, another missing person, if her husband hadn't arrived in time that night. The police assured her Dennis would be locked up and no longer a threat. Sana and her husband left the police station. They drove home in the quiet darkness. She glanced over at her husband, grateful that he had arrived just in time. But deep down, a new sense of caution had been born. She would never let her guard down like that again. The man passed through the door. It was a quiet evening. Abi was home alone as usual. Her mother often had to work 2 jobs in one day, from morning to late at night. So Abi had to take care of herself most of the time, and she was used to it. The house was peaceful. Her mother wouldn't be home for hours, so she took care of everything herself, from cooking to locking up, getting ready for bed. Before going to bed, Abi planned to relax a bit. She sat on the couch, ready to watch TV with a tub of ice cream in her hand. Suddenly, there was a knock at the door. She froze, spoon of ice cream halfway to her mouth. It was strange her friends never visited this late, and her mom always used her key. Confused, she slowly walked to the door. She wasn't exactly scared, just curious. She opened the door and saw him a man. He stood there with his hands in his pockets, looking on. He was bald, wore thick glasses, and had a scruffy beard with dark circles under his eyes, like he hadn't slept in days. He didn't seem threatening, but something felt off. Abi greeted him, and the man smiled and asked, "Hello, little girl. Are your parents home?" At the time, she didn't think much of it, assuming it was just a friendly question. So Abi foolishly answered that her mom wasn't home. A smile spread across his face, but then she started to feel uneasy as his questions grew too interested. He smiled and said, "Good night. Don't get into any trouble," then walked away. Abi didn't understand what had just happened, so she closed the door. Her heart was racing, but she pushed it aside. He was just being friendly, she told herself. Abi returned to her ice cream. Her mind replayed the conversation. Something about the way he had looked at her and smiled made her feel uneasy. 10 minutes passed, and she began to feel comfortable again. The strange encounter faded from her mind. Then, there was another knock at the door. She thought it might be him again. This time, something told her to be cautious. She wasn't sure why, but before opening the door, she decided to lock the chain. When Abi opened the door, the chain caught, preventing it from opening fully. And there he was, the same man from earlier. His eyes widened in surprise, and for a moment, he pretended to be friendly again. He stammered a greeting to Abi again, and said he just wanted to make sure she was okay. To her, he no longer seemed friendly. He looked desperate, as if realizing he hadn't gotten into the house and was trying to cover it up. Abi gave a quick thank you out of fear and slammed the door shut, her hands trembling as she locked it. She stood there, frozen, staring at the door. Minutes passed, and she couldn't stop thinking about the man. But every sound, every creak of the house made her jump. She needed her mom and wished she were home. Suddenly, she heard the man's voice again, this time coming from the mail slot of the front door. He was whispering through the slot, saying he wanted to come in and had something to tell Abi. Abi froze in place. She screamed, "Leave me alone." The mail slot slammed shut, and then the pounding on the door started. He was banging hard, rattling the doorknob violently, shouting crude words demanding she open the door. She stumbled back, tears streaming down her face, silently praying he wouldn't get in. The banging grew louder, more frantic, as he tried to force the door open. For what felt like an eternity, Abi stood there, sobbing, and then, just as suddenly as it began, it stopped. Perhaps the man had given up and left. She didn't move, only standing there, listening. About 30 minutes later, Abi's mom came home. The door opened, and she rushed in, finding her daughter in tears. Abi told her everything. Her mom immediately called the police about the incident, but they didn't find any trace of the man. As Abi lay in bed that night, she couldn't stop thinking about how lucky she was to have used the door chain. It was a small, almost insignificant decision, but it had saved her. Ghosts in the warehouse. I am a warehouse worker for a small business in my city. I just do certain tasks that need to be done each night. I unload the goods that are delivered and place everything in its proper place. Most of the time, I just wear headphones and listen to music while I work because the warehouse isn't too big. It's rare for someone else to be working overnight with me. The night drags on slowly. The warehouse is eerily quiet, with the only sound being the creaking of the old building. My shift started at 10 o'clock, and there were perhaps some knocking sounds between 12 o'clock and 1 o'clock a.m. I stopped, took off my headphones, and tried to listen to the sound again, but it had stopped. As I returned to work, the knocking resumed, this time louder, more persistent. I froze, facing the source of the sound, a narrow, dark aisle flanked by towering shelves. The knocking stopped when I reached the aisle, leaving only darkness. As I neared the front of the warehouse, I noticed the front door slightly ajar. Confused, I recalled that I had locked it when I arrived. I walked up and pushed the door open, finding the latch broken. I quickly locked the door again, this time jamming a nearby metal bar against it for extra security. But the gesture felt futile. Determined to finish my shift, I returned to my duties, but my focus was shattered. Every creak of the building, every flicker of the lights felt like a warning. Suddenly, the overhead lights flickered and went out, plunging the warehouse into darkness. I pulled out my flashlight to cut through the blackness. The beam revealed only empty aisles, but the feeling of being watched lingered. As I moved through the warehouse, the flashlight caught fleeting glimpses of shadows darting out of sight, too quick to be fully seen. My fear surged as I raced towards the front door. I saw the metal bar I had wedged into the door bent and twisted. I turned to face the darkness, the flashlight trembling in my hand. The light revealed a tall, indistinct figure watching me from the shadows. I started breathing rapidly. The figure moved slowly towards me, its footsteps echoing loudly in the silent warehouse. In a last desperate act, I threw the flashlight at the figure and dashed into the darkness, hoping to find another way out. My frantic sprint led me to the back door of the warehouse, but just as I was about to escape, the door slammed shut, as if someone from behind had done it. I panicked and turned around, but as I was about to run back, my flashlight suddenly flickered back on, illuminating a reflection of myself in a large mirror hidden behind some old boxes. But it wasn't me. A darker version, with a blurred face, slowly raised its hand, moving while I stood frozen. It seemed to be hypnotizing me, trying to pull me somewhere. It said, "Follow me," and then gave a terrifying smile. I stumbled, too frightened to think, and grabbed the door handle, yanking it with all my strength, then ran outside, gasping for air as the fog seemed to swallow me whole. As I ran, I heard footsteps again, echoing through the mist.
Help!
I turned around, but the warehouse was almost invisible through the thick fog. I collapsed to the ground, exhausted, as I turned back to face whatever was chasing me, but there was nothing there. I pulled out my phone and called the police, trembling with fear. When they finally arrived, they thoroughly searched the warehouse, but found no trace of an intruder. If I hadn't realized the door was broken, I would have faced that strange thing directly, with no way of knowing what would have happened. Although unlikely, I can't shake the feeling that it's still chasing me. So I quit the job, hoping I'll never encounter it again. Killer in the Rain. It's late spring in a rural area with vast stretches of wilderness. My small house stands alone in the vast darkness, surrounded by trees, the type of isolation I always dreamed of before moving here. Here, I can live away from the noise, people, and stress of the city. But tonight, the silence feels different. Heavy rain has been pouring for days. I should have found this isolation peaceful, but tonight, it feels suffocating. I'm sitting on an old couch watching TV and listening to the rain pounding on the roof, a soothing sound that usually makes evenings pass peacefully. I enjoy staying home on rainy weekends like this, far away from the world. Around 6 or 7 in the evening, I suddenly heard a knock at the door. At first, I thought it was the wind, but it wasn't. Another knock, this time louder. I hesitated. Visitors were rare here. It was strange for someone to show up without calling first. Grabbing a flashlight, I walked toward the door, my heart already starting to race. When I opened the door, heavy rain poured down, and the damp cold hit my face. Standing in the pouring rain was a man, soaked and shivering. He wasn't anyone I knew, just a stranger. He told me he was camping in the nearby woods and had run into trouble. He needed a place to stay, just for the night. His voice was pleading, but something about him made me uneasy. I handed him my phone to call for help so he could get a ride to town, as I didn't feel safe. But he refused, insisting he only needed shelter for the night. I felt uncomfortable, the rain pouring down on both of us. His insistence made me even more suspicious. I bluntly told him he couldn't stay here. After pausing for a moment, he turned and walked down the dirt path leading back to the woods. I watched him disappear into the trees, his figure fading into the rain. I locked the door immediately, still feeling uneasy. I tried to shake off the strange encounter, telling myself I did the right thing. There was no way to know if he was dangerous, especially in such a remote place. The rain kept falling, and I sat back down on the couch, trying to focus on the TV. But my mind kept drifting back to that knock at the door. After 2 hours, I noticed something, a faint orange light shining through the curtains at the back of the house. I haven't checked the window in a while, but now there's something outside. I stood up and pulled the curtain aside. Through the rain and mist, I saw it far off in the woods behind my house, a small flickering campfire beneath a tree. Despite the heavy rain, the fire was still burning. There was a figure in the rain, but I couldn't make it out. That uneasy feeling turned into fear. Could it be him again? Why had he returned? And what was he doing out there, just standing near my house in the pouring rain? I picked up the phone and called the police. I didn't care if it took them an hour to get here. I needed someone to ensure he was gone. After the call, I glanced out the window again. The fire was still burning, but the figure had vanished. Panic surged through me. I rushed to the front window and saw him, the man from earlier, walking by with a rifle slung over his shoulder. He was heading toward the house, toward me. I staggered toward the closet in the hallway, my hands shaking as I grabbed the handgun and rubber bullets. I had bought it for protection, but I never really thought I would need it. I didn't want to hurt anyone. I pressed myself against the wall, listening to the man pounding on the front door. This time it was harder, as if he was hitting it with the butt of his rifle. I had to do something. I couldn't let him in. I yelled that I had a gun and it called the police. I stood still, gun in hand, straining to hear any sign of movement. Moments stretched on, and finally, after what felt like an eternity, I looked through the peephole. The porch was empty. I cautiously stepped outside, gun still in hand, immediately drenched by the rain. I saw large footprints, caked in mud. He was probably gone, at least for now. About an hour later, the police arrived and searched the area with flashlights. When they got to the campfire, they found something I hadn't expected. A rough canvas bag, half buried in the mud, covered in wet earth. They dug it up and opened it. Inside they found knives, zip ties, gloves, and rope. They told me it was likely a burglary kit, or worse. I never saw him again after that night. The police haven't found him yet. But they told me to be careful, to stay vigilant. Whoever he was, he had plans to come back, maybe even to kill me. Mysterious man at the fast food restaurant. I had been working at this 24-hour fast food restaurant for years. Most of my night shifts were quiet. However, tonight was different. The night started like any normal shift, nothing out of the ordinary. Our night cook called in sick, leaving me to manage the whole restaurant alone until someone could assist at 4 a.m. The silence in the restaurant was eerie. With no customers around, I spent time cleaning the kitchen, focusing on scrubbing away the grime. Then, I heard a loud noise coming from the front of the restaurant. There was a man outside the entrance. He was standing there, his face pressed against the glass, peering inside and banging on the door. He didn't seem normal, which made me feel uneasy. The door was locked. I approached the glass, trying to stay calm, and gestured for him to go around to the drive-thru. He didn't respond, just stared. I shouted through the glass that the dining area was closed, but he didn't move, just stood there, lifeless. I turned and went back to the kitchen. I tried to continue working, focusing on my tasks. 15 minutes passed, and I convinced myself that he must have left. But the unease still lingered. A beep went off in my headset. Someone had placed an order. I turned on the mic and asked for their order, but all I got was silence. I checked the camera at the drive-thru lane, no car, no sign of anyone. I sighed and turned away, but then I froze. I heard something footsteps, light, careful steps coming from above, as if someone was walking on the roof. I tracked the noise until it stopped at the ladder leading to the maintenance door in the ceiling. The footsteps halted above. I was sure someone was up there. I quickly searched for a lock or anything to secure the door. I had never used it before, so I wasn't sure if it could even lock. I heard the trapdoor creak. It was slowly beginning to open. A small gap appeared, and through it, I saw a pair of cold, unblinking eyes staring at me. Panic consumed me, and without thinking, I turned and ran toward the front door. I bolted outside to my car, gasping for air, my heart pounding in my chest. Trembling, I called the police and described what was happening. From the safety of my car, I glanced back at the restaurant, my eyes scanning the windows, and then I saw him. A shadow moving near the counter. For a moment, he looked directly at me, then suddenly darted into the kitchen. The police arrived and searched the entire building, inside and out, even checking the roof. But the man had vanished, disappeared as if he had never been there. Nothing was stolen. No money, no equipment, nothing was missing. He had broken in, but he didn't take anything from the restaurant, like a strange stalker. After the police left, I sat in my car, staring at the darkened restaurant. My mind kept replaying the moment I saw him look at me in such a strange and unsettling way. I went back to work. My boss had installed a lock on the ceiling door, a safety measure that should have been done long ago. But my job was never the same. From then on, I startled at every sound, never knowing if he would come back. Night at the gas station. That night, snow fell, freezing cold. The wind howled as I drove into the parking lot of the gas station where I worked the night shift. I had been doing this job for a few months now, from 11 p.m. to 7 a.m., as it fit my personal schedule. My coworker's car was the only other vehicle in the lot. I parked next to it, bracing myself for a long night. Nothing but slow hours and an empty store ahead. After greeting my coworker and taking over his shift, I was alone for the rest of the night. As soon as the door closed behind him, I glanced at the task list my manager had left. It was short, just a few tasks that would take less than an hour to complete. Around midnight, a car pulled into the station, catching my attention. It was an old SUV, pulling up to one of the gas pumps. I glanced out the window for a moment before turning back to my phone. A few minutes passed, then 10. I glanced again, surprised to see the SUV still parked there. The headlights were off, the doors closed, but no one had come in to pay or use the restroom. A strange feeling began to creep over me. I grabbed my coat and stepped out into the freezing cold, the wind biting into my skin. The snow crunched beneath my boots as I walked toward the SUV. I peered through the window, calling out, "Hello? Is anyone in there?" But from what I could see through the frosted glass, the car was empty. A chill ran down my spine, not from the cold, but from the growing unease. There was no one in the SUV. But why would someone leave a car parked there, engine off, in freezing temperatures like this? I glanced down and noticed something strange. Footprints in the snow. They led away from the car, but not toward the front of the station. Instead, they extend toward the corner of the gas station. It was too cold for someone to just walk off and disappear like that. I hurried back inside to warm up. Once inside, I turned on the small heater next to the counter. Then a loud noise came from the back of the building. I turned around, looking through the rows of shelves in the station. Empty, nothing there. Slowly, I started walking toward the noise coming from the back of the gas station. There on the floor were small puddles of dirty water, the kind that could only come from melted snow. I followed the trail, leading me to the storage room in the back. I stopped at the door, and in the dim light of the storage room, I saw a figure half hidden among the shelves. He was standing there, tall, broad-shouldered, with a scruffy beard that gave him a disheveled, intimidating look. He was staring right at me. I stood frozen, trembling. My mind raced, trying to process what I was seeing. Who was he? How did he get in? Then he moved slightly, stepping forward. Instinctively, I backed away, my hands trembling as I reached for anything to defend myself with. My fingers touched a metal crowbar leaning against the wall. I gripped it tightly. I stammered, my voice barely a whisper. "Who are you?" but he didn't answer. As I raised the crowbar, the cold metal felt heavy in my hand. I warned him, telling him to back off or I'd call the police. He took another step forward. I screamed louder in desperation, "I'm warning you." I swung the crowbar through the air. He staggered back, slipping on the wet floor. He groaned, clutching his leg as if he twisted it in pain. The opportunity was there, and I didn't miss it. I bolted back to the front of the store. I ran to the counter, my hands shaking uncontrollably as I picked up the store phone and whispered to 911 for help. Every second felt like an hour as I waited, my eyes locked on the storage room door. When the police arrived, I pointed them to the back. 2 officers cautiously entered, flashlights raised as they swept the storage room. I expected to hear them shout out, telling me they'd found him, but instead, they emerged with puzzled looks on their faces. They found wet footprints leading out the back door, disappearing into the snow-covered forest behind the gas station. They followed the trail, but the vast, dark expanse seemed to swallow everything. He had vanished, leaving only a mystery. The SUV had been towed away. I still work the night shift, but every time I hear a noise from the back or see a car pull into the station, I get more cautious. He could be out there, watching, waiting. But one thing is certain, I was lucky to survive that night. Night at the gas station. The return. The memory of that snowy night still lingers in my mind. It's been over 2 weeks, and the police are still searching for him. Since then, unease has stayed with me. I've become more cautious, more aware of every detail. I thought it was over, but I was wrong. Light snow fell tonight, and the parking lot was empty. No cars, no customers, only the constant hum of the station lights and the heater struggling to keep the cold at bay. I gazed out the window, just like I had every night since then. I decided to keep busy with the small tasks my manager had left me. Stocking shelves, wiping the counter, anything to keep my mind occupied. As I bent down to organize some snacks, I heard it. A soft creaking sound from the back. It was the same sound I had heard that night, the one that led me to the storage room. I stood up slowly, waiting, listening for more. I told myself it was nothing, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Just as I began to relax, headlights swept across the parking lot. A car slowly pulled in. It was the same type of SUV again. I froze, watching it stop near the gas pump. I grabbed my coat, knowing I couldn't avoid this. A feeling of dread crept over me as if everything was about to happen again. I stepped outside, the cold wind biting my face as I approached the SUV. I cautiously peered inside. This time, there was someone inside. A man wearing a thick coat, his face partially obscured by a knit hat. I asked, "Do you need help?" The man didn't respond right away. He slowly turned his head, his movements deliberate. Then he spoke in a low, raspy voice. "I am here for what I left behind." Before I could respond, he opened the car door and stepped out. He was tall and moved toward me, and instinctively, I took a step back. I ran inside, slamming the door shut. My fingers fumbled for my phone to call the police. I gasped as I told them, "He's back. The man from before. Please send help." I glanced around, looking for the crowbar I had used before. It was leaning against the wall near the counter. I grabbed it tightly as I heard the man approach the entrance. The door rattled as he tried the handle, but it was locked. Then I heard him move toward the back door. I crept toward the storage room. The back door was still shut, but I knew he was out there. I could hear him moving, his footsteps crunching in the snow. Suddenly, the door handle began to shake. I backed away, gripping the crowbar. The door creaked open slowly, letting in a rush of cold air. I could see his silhouette, It was still him. The scruffy beard, the broad shoulders. His eyes fixed on me, wild and crazed. This time, I didn't wait. I swung the crowbar. He ducked, barely dodging the blow. I swung again, and this time, I hit his arm. He groaned in pain, staggering back, but he didn't fall. Instead, he lunged at me, grabbing the crowbar with a force I didn't expect. The metal slipped from my hands and fell to the ground. I stumbled back. Then I saw my chance the exit, and I ran as fast as I could toward him. I ran outside, the snow crunching beneath my boots. I could hear him behind me. I sprinted toward the forest, needing to get away from him. Branches whipped against my face as I rushed into the woods, the cold biting into my skin, causing sharp pain. I tripped. My foot caught in a tree root hidden beneath the snow. It sapped all the strength out of me. I tried to get up, but before I could move, I felt his hand grab my ankle, pulling me back. I kicked out, sending him staggering with a cry of pain. I got up and kept running toward the edge of the woods. In the distance, I saw the flashing lights of a police car. I collapsed into their arms, gasping for breath, pointing toward the forest. He's still in there. At that moment, he came running out of the woods as the police closed in. For a split second, the crazed smile on his face vanished. He turned to run, but it was too late. The police were right in front of him. He thrashed and squirmed violently as they wrestled him to the ground and cuffed him. The SUV had been towed away, and the man was gone, but the unease remained. The store was quiet again. I walked to the door, staring out at the now empty parking lot. I didn't know why he had come back, what he was after, or what he thought he'd left behind, but I hoped it would be the last time I saw him. Haunting delivery trip. I was working for a food delivery platform on weekends to make some extra money. Between my main job and this side gig, I often felt exhausted. It was past 9 p.m. when I started my shift, picking up small orders and delivering them to random houses. After my first delivery, I drove around the area for a while, waiting for something to come through. 20 minutes passed with nothing. Just as I was about to give up, my phone buzzed with an order for just 1 tacos and a drink. I confirmed the order and headed to the restaurant to pick it up. After grabbing the order, I began the 10-minute drive to the customer's house. It was a normal neighborhood, nothing unusual. As I approached a red light, I noticed a pickup truck stop next to me. Instinctively, I glanced over. The guy in the truck was leaning out of the window, staring straight at my car. I looked away when the light turned green and pressed the gas. I glanced in my rearview mirror. The truck was now in my lane, driving a short distance behind me. As I approached the neighborhood where I was making the delivery, the truck was still behind me. Was he following me? The route was mostly straight, so I wasn't sure if he was just heading in the same direction. I tried to stay calm, but the moment I turned into the neighborhood, I knew. The pickup truck turned in too. Maybe he lived here, I thought. I continued driving through the quiet suburban streets, following the GPS until I reached the final road, a dead end. I braked and parked on the side of the road near the house number I had to deliver to. The truck followed and parked behind me. I sat there, frozen, trying to come up with a plan for the worst-case scenario. What was this guy doing? Was he really following me? I glanced at my phone and saw a message from the customer asking, "When will the food arrive?" Could it be the guy in the truck? Was he the customer waiting for me to step out? I felt more trapped than ever. The man got out of the truck. My heart pounded as I watched him slowly approach my car. He stopped right by my trunk, his face partially hidden in the shadows. Then, out of nowhere, he grabbed something like a metal rod and slammed it into my rear windshield. The glass shattered around me. I screamed and, without thinking, instinctively slammed my foot on the gas. The man jumped onto the back of my car, nearly lying flat as he tried to crawl through the shattered window. I swerved sharply, making a U-turn, and felt him fall off the car. My hands trembled as I maneuvered between the trucks. In the rearview mirror, I saw him stumbling in the street as I sped away. My hands shaking, I picked up the phone to call the police. By the time the police arrived, the man had vanished. All they found were shards of glass scattered across the road. They searched the area, but he was gone. I stood staring at the cracks in my shattered windshield, and memories of the terrifying experience replayed in my mind. I was lucky to have escaped, but deep down I still felt uneasy because he was still out there, haunting Delivery Trip. It's been almost a month since that horrifying night. I haven't driven for the delivery app since then. Every time I think about driving, the echo of shattering glass floods my mind. I try to tell myself it was just an incident, that I was unlucky. There were no witnesses. The police reassured me they'd find him, saying it was probably just a disturbed person trying to scare me. But I couldn't shake the feeling that there had to be some reason he was following me. I decided to try driving again. I needed the money, and I couldn't let fear control my life. I told myself that this time I'd be careful and avoid driving too late at night, and I'd stay away from isolated neighborhoods. As I got into the car, that familiar fear washed over me. My hands were sweaty. I tried to close my eyes, take a deep breath, and turn the key in the ignition. Things started off fine. I was careful and checked my mirrors more frequently. But as the sun set, my phone buzzed with an order that sent a chill down my spine. 1 taco and a drink. A simple order, just like that night. I hesitated, my thumb hovering over the accept button. I figured it was just a coincidence, so I accepted the order. A light drizzle had begun. The drive to Taco felt eerie, as if I was retracing the same steps as that night. I picked up the order and placed it on the passenger seat. As I drove to the delivery address, waves of anxiety hit me. The house was in a different neighborhood, but each turn felt strangely familiar. When I parked at the curb, the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. The headlights of a car behind me suddenly flicked on. I looked, it was a truck, and it looked just like the one from that night. Panic set in as the truck rolled closer, its blinding headlights on full beam. The truck parked right behind me, as if waiting for me to make a move. I tried to text my customer, but I was shaking so badly I couldn't type properly, wasting precious time. Suddenly, a notification popped up on my phone. Customer, when will my order arrive? I couldn't believe it and dropped my phone right then. It was happening again. Could he have been waiting for this moment to get revenge? I couldn't go through this again. I had to act. I pressed the gas, moving my car to another spot. The truck slowed down behind me, its headlights glaring blindingly in my rearview mirror, causing me to squint. Suddenly, the truck surged forward, crashing into the back of my car. The impact jerked me forward, my chest slamming into the steering wheel. Pain shot through my ribs as I gasped, trying to catch my breath. I pressed the gas harder, but the rain had made the road slick, so I had to maintain control to avoid crashing. Panic hit me as he pulled up alongside, rolled down his window, and gave me a sinister smile. Another slam. The back of my car crumpled, and I felt something wet trickling down my head. My head had been injured and was bleeding from the impact against the window when he rammed me again. I braked hard, dazed, my vision blurring from the blood running down my face and the sharp pain in my side. But I couldn't give up. I grabbed my phone and dialed 911 for help. I could see his silhouette through the rain, stepping out of his truck. I refused to give up, flooring the gas and driving blindly. My car slammed into a tree. Desperate to survive, I fumbled for the door handle, trying to get out before he got too close. In the distance, I could hear him screaming angrily. I forced myself to run, sprinting toward the woods at the edge of the road. Suddenly, I tripped. My ankle twisted and sharp pain shot up my leg. I couldn't move. He was almost on top of me, his shadow looming as I tried to crawl toward the edge of the road. I turned to face him. He raised the crowbar high above his head, ready to strike, and I screamed. But then, the sound of police sirens cut through the quiet rain. He froze, trying to run, but it was too late. The police used a taser and tackled him to the ground. He was finally caught. I fainted, slowly losing consciousness. Paramedics loaded me into an ambulance, and a wave of relief washed over me. The nightmare was finally over. The Window Stalker. It all started that day, when I was just a child, too young to fully comprehend the horror that was about to unfold. Our home was always cozy, with large windows in the living room that overlooked the beautiful garden outside. I was sitting on the couch with my back to the window, fully immersed in my favorite TV show. My mother was in the kitchen, doing her usual chores, but then something caught my attention. In the reflection of the TV screen, I saw the silhouette of a man. I could see him through the glass, standing motionless in the garden behind me. I thought it was probably my dad, so I didn't turn around. I called out, "Horror story about a truck driver." As soon as I said that, I saw my mom freeze and then rush into the living room. When my mom saw the figure standing outside the window, her face went blank. I had never seen her look so terrified. I turned around. There he was, a stranger, a scruffy man with wild eyes, just standing there staring at us with a sick, twisted grin. He didn't seem to care that he had been spotted. He just smiled wider, almost enjoying the fear he was causing in my mother and me. Without hesitation, my mom yelled, threatening to call the police if he came closer, but I could sense her fear. And then, he said something that still chills me to this day. He growled through the glass with a menacing voice, "If you touch that phone, I'll break this window, and neither of you will be safe." My mom hesitated, torn between calling for help and protecting me, unsure of what to do next. His eyes flared with anger as he fumbled with something inside his coat. And then, in the blink of an eye, he lunged toward the back door. I heard him pounding on it, frantically rattling the doorknob. Thank God it was locked. His frustration turned into rage. He screamed, demanding to be let in, threatening that if he got inside, he wouldn't spare us. I was too young to fully grasp the danger we were in. My mom grabbed me, pulling me off the couch, and we ran upstairs. We didn't stop until we reached the top floor, and that's when I saw my uncle, my mom's younger brother. My uncle was standing in the hallway, headphones on, completely unaware of the chaos downstairs. He was a big, muscular man, the kind you wouldn't want to mess with. He used to compete in boxing matches and had won several trophies. My uncle, confused, asked, "What's going on?" as my mom frantically explained. And just as she finished, we heard the man's voice again, coming from downstairs. His voice echoed through the house, saying, "The boogeyman is coming to get you." Those words were etched into my memory. My uncle heard it and told us to lock ourselves in the bathroom and call the police. My mom pulled me into the bathroom, locked the door as instructed, and called 911. I could hear the man downstairs, his voice growing more erratic. Then, the sound of glass shattering echoed throughout the house. My mom and I held our breath, frozen in fear, waiting for what felt like an eternity for something to happen. We waited and prayed that it was over. Footsteps echoed up the stairs. We braced ourselves, fearing the worst. My uncle slowly stepped out of his hiding spot, waiting for the perfect moment to tackle the man. relying on his sharp reflexes as a seasoned boxer. He didn't hold back and swiftly disarmed the man. My uncle saved us. The door swung open, and the police arrived just in time, securing the situation.
Car 36 responding.
They arrested the man and informed us that he was a dangerous criminal they had been hunting for some time. That day changed everything. My mom never felt comfortable being alone again and always looked over her shoulder at the windows. If it hadn't been for my uncle, I don't know what would have happened. I still shudder when I think about it. Whispers behind the door. It's been 9 years since that happened, but I still remember it clearly. In the middle of the city, I rented a small apartment in an old, damp-smelling building. With my job as a waiter, it was all I could afford, just enough to get by. Not long after, something strange began to happen. It started with small noises, almost unnoticeable at first. A faint voice, muttering in the middle of the night. I remember waking up that first night, the sound barely audible, like someone whispering on the other side of the wall. The walls weren't well insulated, so I could hear it. At first, I thought it was a dream. The voice was too distant to make out clearly. But soon, the words became clearer, sharper. "Go die." The words echoed in the dark, sending chills down my spine. I sat up, every hair on my neck standing on end. Who would say such a thing? My eyes darted toward the door. I got out of bed, quietly stepping toward the peephole. Slowly, I saw a thin man, shirtless, his face twisted into a wide, terrifying smile. His hand scratched slowly at the door with a single finger, the gentle sound of it sending chills through me. He just stood there, scratching the door and whispering. From that day on, the man became a frequent, unwelcome visitor. Every 2 or 3 nights, he would return, scratching at my door, mumbling, and sometimes singing in a shrill, childlike voice. The sound was terrifying, like a nightmarish lullaby. Every time I looked through the peephole, there he was, whispering threats. I thought about confronting him, flinging the door open, and demanding he stop. But I couldn't see his hands, they were out of view, and I feared he might be holding something dangerous. The mumbling stopped. Everything was silent. I leaned forward, cautiously pressing my ear against the door. Then a loud knock startled me, sending me falling backward. He said,
"I know you're there. Be careful."
But in the daytime, it was as if nothing had happened between us. I'd run into him in the hallway, and he would smile politely, nod, and walk away. I even asked him once why he kept coming to my door at night. He seemed surprised, then confused, denying any knowledge of what I was talking about. One night, I was about to sleep, but I had to grab something from the living room. The mumbling started again, but this time, it felt much closer. I crept toward the bedroom door, checking to make sure it was locked. Thank God it was. But the doorknob turned slowly, rattling as if he was testing it. Then silence for a long while. I didn't know how he had gotten in. I was terrified, but after the silence lasted long enough, I decided to go out and check. I stepped outside. From the corner near the door, I saw my thin neighbor banging his head against the wall, singing something I couldn't understand. I was truly frightened. I tried to talk to him, but he only turned and threatened me. I stumbled back, startled, but he wasn't hurt. He just kept grinning and eventually walked out of the apartment by himself. I decided I had had enough and finally called the police. They took him to a psychiatric ward. He was diagnosed with schizophrenia and had escaped from a mental hospital 2 months earlier. Apparently, he had a violent history. In fact, he had been admitted after attacking a mailman with a shovel and had snuck out undetected. Now I live in another city, far from that building, far from the memories of those nights. But sometimes, I still can't sleep well, unable to shake the feeling that he might come back. The stalker. I worked as a cashier at a home improvement store, and my coworker, Nicole, quickly became my best friend. She was very sweet, a bit shy, and unfortunately, she was often hit on by customers. Most of the time, it was just harmless flirting or a dinner invitation that she politely declined. But one day, something different happened. Nicole told me about a man who had asked her out. She had declined, as usual, saying that she had a boyfriend. The man seemed irritated but left without causing any trouble. Later that day, he came back. Nicole was helping a customer, so I was alone at the counter when he approached me. He looked quite handsome, but there was something about him that made me feel uncomfortable. He spoke in a deep voice and said he was there to see Nicole. I asked how he knew her, and he lied, saying she had agreed to go out with him and that he was there to pick her up. I knew that wasn't true, so I told him she had already left, hoping he would go away. Instead, his expression darkened, and he crossed his arms, asking why he couldn't see her. Thinking quickly, I blurted out, "She's my fiancée." It was a lie, but it was the only thing I could think of to make him back off. His eyes narrowed, and he looked me up and down with disdain.
Someone like her with someone like you?
He scoffed at me. I held my ground, repeating that she wasn't available. He stared at me for a long moment before turning and leaving. I told Nicole what happened when she came back, and she felt creeped out but also found the fiancé excuse quite amusing. We laughed about it, thinking it was over. But 2 weeks later, the man returned, this time after dark. Nicole and I were closing up when we heard a loud bang on the glass door. We both jumped, and there he was, pressing his face against the glass, his eyes wild. "We're closed," I told him, but he didn't move. Nicole shouted at him to go away, but he just stared at us, his breath fogging up the glass. He pointed at me, his eyes full of rage. He yelled,
"I'm not here for her. I'm here for you. If I take out her husband, she'll be mine."
My heart pounded as I realized he intended to kill me. I told Nicole to run to the manager's office and call the police.
911, what's the emergency, please?
As she ran off, the man started ramming the doors, trying to break them down. I was terrified, but I knew I had to keep him outside. I grabbed a 2x4 from behind the counter, ready to defend myself if he got in. The glass doors shook violently, and I was sure they were about to give way. But then Nicole came running back, swinging another piece of wood and yelling that the police were on their way. The man finally stopped, glaring at me one last time before turning and disappearing into the night. The police arrived, but by then, he was long gone. We showed them the security footage, and they promised to keep an eye out for him. A few days later, we heard he had been arrested in a nearby town for stalking another woman. Nicole and I were both shaken by the experience. We quit our jobs shortly after and found safer work. We still talk about that night sometimes, grateful that we had each other's backs. But the memory of his twisted expression and the sound of him trying to break in still haunts me. Horror Story Red Bracelet. I have worked at the hospital for 10 years, something I am very proud of. Most people I meet here have an average working time of just 1 year. The shortest time someone stayed was 1 week. Working here is not easy. They say staff are cursed if they do something wrong. Lights fall on people's heads. They slip on completely dry floors. and fires frequently break out. Patients sometimes become inexplicably violent. No matter how many times they inspect the building or add security staff, the employees always seem to be targeted by bad luck. Even after many years here, I don't know why, but I don't believe in that. I just try to do my best at work. Since working here, nothing unfortunate has ever happened to me. Sometimes I hear strange noises, but they are insignificant. I've gotten used to it and become resilient. One night after a late shift, I stepped into the elevator and immediately pressed the close button to slowly descend to the lobby from the 11th floor, alone. When it reached the 9th floor, the door opened. Reflexively, I reached out to press the close button but stopped when I saw someone standing there. It was a beautiful young girl I had never seen before, probably a new intern. Something about her made me want to talk and ask about her work. I placed my arm in the door to let her in. I asked if she was new. She shyly nodded without saying anything. I was very happy to get to know her. I saw her name tag. Her name was Ilsa. Every night after that, after my shift, at the same time on the 9th floor, Ilsa would be standing there waiting. This surprised me, but I thought it was just a coincidence. She didn't say anything, just bowed her head shy. For the first time in a long while, I decided to open up and make a new friend. One night, while going down in the elevator, as expected, the door opened on the 9th floor where Ilsa was waiting to get in. I decided to ask if she would like to have a drink with me. As soon as she stepped in, she heard a loud noise at the end of the hallway. Both of us looked out. From the corner of the hallway, a dark figure of a man appeared. He was tall, limping, and heading straight for the elevator.
Wait!
The man called out, "And now." She immediately reached out her hand to hold the door. The man sped up and shouted, "Help me! Help!" As the man got closer, my stomach began to churn. Wait, something wasn't right with me. The man was now just a few steps away from the elevator. He waved at us, revealing a red wristband that was bleeding. I immediately pulled Ilsa back and closed the elevator door. He pounded on the door continuously. I recalled the cold, clinical atmosphere of the morgue. The bodies lay on metal slabs, each with a red wristband. The image of a young girl's lifeless hand, limp from the weight of the wristband, flashed through his mind. His heart pounded, a mix of confusion and fear. The elevator swayed, bringing Jazz back to the present. He looked at Ilsa again. She slowly and coldly said,
"Why did you do that? Why didn't you help him?"
I replied,
I couldn't help him. He was wearing a red wristband, which is only for the deceased in the morgue.
She didn't speak. Then suddenly, she pressed the button to go down to the warehouse basement. Even I rarely go down there alone. I followed Ilsa down a narrow, dark corridor he hadn't noticed before. The walls were adorned with old, faded photos of patients and staff, all wearing red wristbands. The air grew colder. Then her hand fell down, revealing a red wristband. Her back was covered in numerous torn shirt marks. I froze, wondering what this was. Dizzy, dreaming perhaps. I started screaming loudly, and she gave me a horrifying smile. At that moment, all I could do was run for my life, and she kept slowly following me. When I reached the elevator door, I pressed the button frantically, uncontrollably. But the elevator didn't open. My breathing was so rapid I couldn't control it. I just stood there, eyes closed, praying. I held my breath because she was only a few meters behind me, walking slowly. Without waiting any longer, I had to find the emergency exit to run up to the first floor. I ran like I had never run before. Thank God I escaped that dreadful, terrifying place. I might have stayed there too long. It was probably time to leave. The next day, I quit my job. Years later, after I left, I learned that it had been officially abandoned without any explanation. It was a horrifying and unforgettable experience for me. Take the wrong Uber driver. It was late November, and we had a small party. I stumbled out of the bar into the freezing cold air. I stood on the sidewalk, the world around me spinning slightly, my mind foggy from the alcohol. My friends stayed behind, eager to celebrate a little longer, but I had a flight to catch the next morning. I needed to pack. I needed to sleep, so I booked an Uber to take me home. I opened the app, and luckily, a driver accepted almost instantly. The app showed it would arrive in 4 minutes. Then, a car pulled up. The car's headlights flashed at me. From a distance, I thought I saw someone wave at me from the window. I was tired, and maybe my app was just glitching. The driver must have arrived early, that's all. Without thinking much, I stumbled into the car. Inside, the car smelled faintly of old cigarettes, and the seat creaked beneath me. I glanced at the driver in the front seat. He didn't look back at me, didn't say a word. He didn't even confirm my name. I just wanted to get home. I muttered my address and leaned back in the seat. It was then that I noticed the GPS on his dashboard was turned off. I was startled. Why hadn't he entered my address into his GPS? Everyone uses GPS for Uber, even drivers familiar with the area. I watched him drive, hoping he just knew the route well. The car sped down the street, but something felt off. This wasn't the way to my dorm. I nervously told him.
I think you're going the wrong way. My school is in the opposite direction.
For a moment, he didn't respond. Then, he glanced in the rearview mirror and nodded, but he didn't turn the car around. He just kept driving. I started to panic. Where was he taking me? The car stopped in front of a rundown office building. The street was deserted. Why had he stopped here? He didn't say a word. He unbuckled his seatbelt and stepped out of the car. Slamming the door shut, my mind raced. My hands trembled as I slowly pulled out my phone. My heart sank when I saw the missed calls from my actual Uber driver. I'd gotten into the wrong car. This wasn't my Uber. I was in danger. I needed to get out now. I quickly sent my location to a friend via text. If I called the police, he might hear me. But then I heard a slow, low chuckle. I looked up through the window, and there he was, smirking at me, staring. He circled the car. My hand moved toward the door, pressing down the lock. He hadn't noticed. I frantically moved from door to door, locking each one in a frenzy. The faint noise alerted him. His smile vanished, his eyes narrowed in anger. He stepped closer to the driver's door, his hand reaching for the handle. When it didn't open, he angrily pulled at it, yelling, "Open the door!" I knew I only had a few seconds left. Desperate, not waiting any longer, I grabbed my phone and dialed 911, hoping they could get there faster. I didn't get a chance to speak. The sound of glass shattering stopped me, and I screamed as I saw him punch the window with his bare hand, glass flying everywhere. His arm pushed through the broken window. I dropped my phone, desperately trying to get away from him, clutching the door handle on the other side, frantically unlocking it to escape before he could grab me. I ran as fast as I could since he was injured and stuck with his hand in the broken window. I couldn't stop. I stumbled but kept running, my body filled with overwhelming terror. The night was pitch black, with the only light coming from the distant glow of the city. The abandoned lot stretched endlessly, nowhere to hide. But I kept running, praying that somehow I would survive. I spotted a small store up ahead, its neon open sign flickering weakly in the distance. My legs burned, but I didn't dare look back, not until I reached the store. I burst through the door, gasping for breath, my entire body shaking with fear. The store clerk stared at me, wide-eyed in surprise. But I was thankful I had escaped him. The police arrived minutes later. 2 patrol cars stopped in front of the office building where the car had been parked. But when they got there, the car and the man were gone. Only shattered, blood-stained glass remained. The police reassured me that they would search for him. It was a hard lesson learned that I must always be more careful when going out alone, especially when I'm not fully alert. Strangers in the online classroom. Online classes have now become a part of our academic lives, and no matter how much I try to adapt, I still prefer in-person learning because it helps me focus better. I live alone in a small rented apartment, away from my family. That day, my last class ended at 9 p.m. I pretended to pay attention, but in reality, I was scrolling through my phone under the desk, sipping on an energy drink to stay awake. The lecture went on, and I barely listened. The class was about to end, and as soon as my teacher logged out, a few friends and I decided to stick around and chat. We were joking around, unwinding after a long day when suddenly, something strange happened. The familiar sound of someone joining the conversation echoed through my headphones. A new name appeared, Tim OO. None of us knew who this was, but we thought it was just one of our friends playing a prank on us. At first, it was funny. We laughed, waiting for them to reveal their identity. The camera on this new person's feed turned on, but the screen was pitch black. We couldn't see anything, and all we could hear was heavy, raspy breathing through the microphone. One of my friends, Thomas, decided to break the tension by mocking the situation. He joked,
"Oh no, I'm so scared."
Our laughter was forced, half-hearted at best. Then the stranger spoke. The voice didn't sound entirely human. It was deep, distorted, as if they were using a voice modulator. My body went cold, and my skin tingled with fear. The laughter stopped. No one said a word. Thomas asked, his voice trembling,
"Who are you?"
I wanted to believe it was still a joke, but deep down, I knew something was wrong. The screen shifted. Something moved forward. Now I could see more, just enough to make out a face. But the face was wrong. It was distorted, twisted. One eye was higher than the other, and the mouth curved into a bizarre grin. The low-resolution camera made it even creepier, as if the features were shifting, morphing before my eyes. I wanted to believe it was a mask, but it didn't look like one. My heart pounded in my chest, cold sweat trickling down my forehead. Thomas wasn't laughing anymore. No one was. We were frozen, staring at this grotesque figure, unable to look away. Then the stranger spoke again, this time calling Thomas by name. I got goosebumps when he said,
"Because you've been so mean to me, I'll punish you first."
Thomas turned pale. His nickname in the chat was just Student 17. There was no way this person could know his real name. My mind was spinning. Who was this person? How did they know Thomas's name? I could hear him gasping through the mic, his voice shaking as he stammered,
"How do you know my name?"
The screen flickered again, and the image disappeared. I leaned closer to the screen, squinting, trying to make out the faint image. I messaged Thomas in a private chat, asking if he was okay, but fear gnawed at me. What if this wasn't just a joke? What if that person knew where Thomas lived? What if they knew where I lived? Wet, dragging footsteps echoed through the speakers, growing louder, closer. Suddenly, the figure leaned in, its grotesque face filling the screen. The camera was now so close that I could see every horrifying detail: cracked and peeling skin, hollow, white, soulless eyes. We screamed in panic. My hands were shaking uncontrollably. I shouted for Thomas to log out and escape. Without hesitation, we shut the laptop. My heart was pounding so hard, it felt like it was about to leap out of my chest. I double-checked, quickly locking all the windows and doors. I grabbed my phone to check on Thomas, to make sure he was okay. But as I did, I felt something in my room. I knew it was irrational, just my mind playing tricks on me, but the fear was real. That night, I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that deformed, decaying face staring at me from the darkness. Even though the call had ended, the fear lingered. The next morning, I texted Thomas, and a wave of relief washed over me when he finally replied. He was safe. Nothing had happened to him overnight, but none of us could shake the lingering terror. We told our teacher about what had happened, but no one could explain it. And just like my classmates, no one confessed to playing this prank. No one could tell us who Tim OO was or how he had entered our chat. Days passed, but the fear lingered, clinging to me like a shadow. Every time I logged into class, I checked the participants list. I still couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't over. Maybe he was out there, watching us. The clown in the tree. This happened to me when I was 14. It was the same year everyone was talking about creepy clowns lurking in random places. The stories were everywhere, but I never took them seriously until I had an encounter of my own. I was sitting alone in the living room. My parents had gone to my grandparents' house for the evening, leaving me home by myself. But instead of feeling free, there was a strange unease I couldn't shake. I texted some friends, inviting them over to kill time John and Emma. We played video games for a while, but after a few hours, we got bored. John had an idea. He said, "Let's go into the woods." There was a forest right behind my house that we usually avoided, especially at night. But it was still light out, and with nothing else to do, I agreed. We gathered ourselves and headed out. Part of me regretted it as soon as we left the house. The forest was dense, tall trees casting cool shade, but we weren't scared. We joked around, tossed sticks, and laughed about nothing. We had been there for about 20 or 30 minutes when we heard something strange. Someone was crying. The sound was faint but unmistakable, like sobbing, desperate, coming from deep within the trees. We all stopped, staring at each other. John was the first to break the silence, whispering tensely, "What the hell is that?" None of us knew, and Emma suggested we go check it out. I wanted to say no, but before I could, everyone was already heading towards the sound. My heart started pounding harder with each step. Something felt wrong, like we were walking into a place we shouldn't. As we got closer, we saw a figure slumped on a large branch of an old tree. It was a man, dressed as a clown. His outfit was white with black polka dots, but it was stained and torn. He wore a black wig, but it was messy, and his makeup was smeared by what looked like tears. He just sat there, quietly crying. John, being the idiot he was, yelled, "Hey, you idiot! Why are you crying up there?" A chill ran down my spine, and I instantly turned to John, telling him to shut up. But it was too late. The clown looked down at us, his tear-streaked face twisting into a smile. His lips curled upward, but it was hollow, as if he was trying to express something through invisible pain. And then I saw it. His hand, gripping a large machete, the blade covered in what looked like blood. We were frozen. He just sat there, staring at us, his smile widening grotesquely, yet his eyes were cold, emotionless. He said, "You won't understand, but when I show you, you will." Panic surged through me, and without thinking, I screamed, "Run!" We scattered, running in all directions. My heart pounded, my feet barely touching the ground as I sprinted towards home. The forest seemed endless, branches scratching at my skin as I ran. I could hear the others screaming, their voices fading as we were separated. I reached the edge of the woods, sprinting into my backyard. I didn't stop until I was inside, slamming the door behind me. Then, I waited for my friends. Emma made it back, panting and pale with fear. But John wasn't with us. We waited for him, hoping he'd burst through the door, laughing about how scared we were. But then we waited, and no one came. We called the police. They came and searched the forest. We told them everything: the clown, the machete, the crying. They didn't seem surprised. It turned out the man we saw was a local. He had been on the run for days. The police said he was a heavy drug user who had killed his wife and left her body wrapped in a white sheet. The next day, they found John. He was dead, discovered in a deep lake in the forest. The man must have chased him while the rest of us ran. I couldn't believe it. John was gone, just like that. And it was my fault for agreeing to go into that forest. If I hadn't, maybe he would still be alive. I told my parents everything, and they promised never to leave me home alone again. But it didn't help much. I couldn't sleep for weeks, and when I did, I had nightmares of the clown standing in the forest, smiling at me with his blood-stained machete. It's been 5 years since that night. I'm 19 now, but the memory of what happened in the forest is still burned into my mind. John's disappearance and the discovery of his body in the lake. It haunts me. No one ever talked about it after the police closed the case. A tragic accident, they said. A drug-crazed maniac. But I knew there was more to it. For years, I pushed the memories down, but recently, they've started to resurface. It began with nightmares, the image of the clown, his twisted smile. But lately, it's been more real, as if he's not just in my dreams anymore. Something is coming for me. I've started feeling like I'm being watched again, just like back then. And tonight, I swear I saw him, standing at the edge of the forest behind my house, staring at me. I grabbed a flashlight, pepper spray, and a taser. I don't even know what I was thinking, but I couldn't sit here, paralyzed by fear anymore. The only way to end this is to go back to where it all started. The air was thick with silence as I stepped outside, the flashlight casting weak beams through the trees. The moment I entered the forest, each step felt heavier than the last, as if the woods themselves were pulling me deeper into the darkness. I didn't know where I was going, but my legs seemed to remember the way. Soon enough, I found myself back at the place where we had first seen the clown crying. Suddenly, the rustling of leaves shattered the silence. I froze. The sound of snapping twigs grew closer. I slowly turned around. The flashlight shook in my trembling hands, illuminating a figure perched on a branch, whistling. It was him. He looked just like before, his white clothes smeared with dirt and something darker dried blood. His black wig was still a tangled mess. He just sat there, staring, holding the machete. The clown tilted his head, his smile twisting even more as he jumped down effortlessly, walking slowly, deliberately toward me. He said, "Welcome back." I was so angry I almost cried, yelling that I knew what he had done to John. The clown's smile faded, replaced by a fake look of pity. "You don't understand," he whispered. "I didn't kill him. He chose it." I shook my head, backing away. His words. When I ran, I remembered seeing John hesitate, standing still. He didn't seem scared, more like mesmerized. And what he said before we ran into the woods, he looks sad, doesn't he? I snapped back to reality as the clown got closer, saying that when it was my turn, I'd understand. His words hit me like a punch. I stumbled backward, tripping over a fallen branch. The flashlight slipped from my hand, flickering as it rolled across the ground. Darkness enveloped me, and I reached to grab it, but the clown's footsteps were closer now. I looked up and saw him towering over me, raising the machete. I pulled the pepper spray from my pocket and sprayed it. He staggered for a moment. But then I heard a voice that sounded like John's. "Alex, you need to leave." I don't know how. I didn't look back at the clown. I just ran. His laughter echoed behind me. Suddenly, I was standing in my backyard, alone. The forest was quiet now, the house dark and still. I rushed inside and called the police, convinced he was still out there. When the police arrived this time, he was there. They found him crouched near the lake, clutching the machete. His clothes were soaked in blood and dirt. He didn't resist when they approached. Later, they interrogated him for hours. The clown believed he was chosen to lead people to the other side. The police dismissed it as the ramblings of a madman. But even then, I knew something darker was at play.